to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hi everyone, welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. My mental health tip for the day has to do with finding humor in things. You know, finding humor in a stressful situation can help you from taking things too seriously, and that's essential for good mental health. So picture this. As I walked into my bedroom this morning, I discovered my business cards that I keep neatly stacked on top of my bedroom dresser, strewn all over the floor. And my cat was just sitting nonchalantly amongst the cards looking up at me. Now, I had a choice. I could have gotten upset because this is just one of many things that cats do throughout the day to increase your blood pressure. You know, hairballs are probably at the top of the list. Or find the humor in the situation. And that's what I did. That's what I usually try to do. You know, personally, I find it helpful to attribute human qualities to cats to add humor to the situation. So in this case, I thought to myself, this cat knows I thrive on organization. He's just messing with me to see what I'll do. Research shows that laughter not only helps you physically by boosting your immune system and releasing endorphins, you know, those feel-good chemicals in your brain, but also helps you relax and improve relationships. In fact, I even came across some research that shows that anticipating a laugh reduces stress hormones. So if you're bothered by something this week, try to keep things in perspective and challenge yourself to find the humor in the situation. And that's my mental health tip for the day. Okay, today's podcast episode is with Jeff Viers, and without further ado, here's Jeff. Well, today I am joined by Jeff Viers, who is a licensed senior psychological examiner in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning.
Well, we always like to start the Make a Mental Note podcast by introducing our guests to the audience. So if you wouldn't mind, if you could just tell a little bit about who you are, what you do for a living, and all that kind of good stuff.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Well, I guess the main things to know about me, I'm the son of a coal miner. My mother was a coal miner's daughter. I come from the southwestern part of Virginia, which is a big coal mining region. I went to high school in Virginia, but I got my undergraduate education at Elon College, which is now Elon University in North Carolina, neighboring state.
Okay.
And finished that up in the early 90s. And then came to Middle Tennessee in the early 90s. And by the late 90s, I had finished my master's degree in clinical psychology from Middle Tennessee State University. And became licensed as a psychological examiner. As a psychological examiner, had to work under the supervision of psychologists. And for a while worked in a mental health center as a crisis intervention counselor. And initially I was doing triage by telephone at a crisis intervention center. And then after the master's degree, actually was in the field doing crisis intervention with people in the metro Nashville area. Some of that was work in hospital emergency rooms. Some of it was just in the community, actually with homeless people under bridges, homeless shelters, people with addictions, a full array of mental and substance abuse disorders, and people that were in crisis, sometimes, you know, came to the attention of the Crisis Intervention Center by the police department, Metro Police. I did an internship at the women's prison in Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville. And then did my thesis research on smoking cessation, so understanding, you know, what keeps people addicted and how to help people beat that addiction. And then the after the crisis intervention experience, I went to another mental health center and worked in the adult outpatient program as a psychotherapist, and did that for a couple, 3 years, and then entered private practice in Murfreesboro. I have been in private practice in Murfreesboro since 2003 on a full-time basis.
Okay. So really, you've had a lot of different experiences over the years. I'm just kind of interested why you went into the helping profession to begin with. What's your story about that?
Why did I go into the helping professions?
Yeah.
Well, I had a pretty rocky childhood, I guess you would say.
Uh-huh.
My dad died when I was 11,
Mm-hmm.
and I was beginning to recover from that, but then I had a brother who was killed in an automobile accident
Oh boy.
about a year and a half later. And I told you I was the son of a coal miner. Well,
Yeah.
I grew up in Appalachia, so there were not a lot of resources available.
Uh-huh.
And there was a stigma, attached to, I was born in the 60s, child of the 70s. So there weren't a lot of counselors available in that rural community.
Mm-hmm.
And even if there had been, I imagine there would have been, quite a bit of stigma attached to going to counseling at that point in time. I think as a society, there's much less of that today. I see many more people are willing to come to counseling today.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And talk about a wide range of problems. Whereas in the past, people, would have just thought, well, that's, if you go to see, a mental health professional, you must be crazy kind of thing.
Right.
But so I went ahead and went to high school, and I was always a good student, but I certainly did get depressed and anxious after losing my father and losing my brother and not having an outlet for dealing with that. So it was really after my bachelor's degree and when I was entering graduate school that I started my own personal counseling. Mm-hmm. And originally I was going to get my degree and become a history professor.
Huh.
But I really, benefited a great deal from meeting with a psychologist for that individual counseling, one-on-one. Mm-hmm. It was interestingly enough, it was a man who would have been about my father's age. So it's kind of a surrogate father figure.
Sure.
And became a mentor. And so I benefited greatly from that, personal counseling experience. And I changed my major in graduate school to clinical psychology. The big thing that people can take away from my personal experience is there's no need in this day and age for people to suffer in silence.
Uh-huh.
There are so many well-trained and compassionate people out there that, it takes courage for people to reach out and ask for help.
It sure does.
But in this day and age, there's no reason, for people to suffer in silence. So, if you're having a problem, talk to someone, and it can begin with a friend or a family member that you really trust. But, sometimes our problems don't get resolved that way. Take it to the next level. Speak to a professional. So,
well, I think and I agree with that. And, when you were talking before about, losing your father, losing your brother, I think, of a lot of the guests that we've had on the Make a Mental Note podcast that, when I ask that question, it's interesting how many people go into the profession because of personal, not only losses, but just personal experiences, things that have happened to them in some form or fashion that kind of influence their decision to go into the field. And like you said, going into counseling, I've been in counseling too. And I think that having that experience of being on the other side, sitting in that chair, and having that experience, I think that really plays an important role as well in really helping understand what clients are going through and what it's like to be a client, to experience that vulnerability. And
absolutely.
And I think that gives you that empathy in a sense. Mm-hmm. And, in the clients that you see, Jeff, and that you've seen over the years, they've had different types of issues that they've talked about with you. Do you find that there are common themes or stories that seem to underlie their problems? If you kind of think about, what your take is on why people have the problems they do, talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, in my practice, I see adults, and it's individual counseling at this point. At some point, I would like to add group therapy.
Yeah.
my counseling patients typically are people who are struggling with depression, anxiety, and or grief. And of course, that pretty much is the background that I come out of. So
Yes.
I've walked through that myself. So people who have suffered a loss. And my main two approaches to therapy are Rogerian. I work really well with those people who just need a safe place to talk about what's been going on in their lives.
Yes.
So maybe they've had no one to talk to. So just creating that safe atmosphere. And then also giving them some new coping skills. And for that, I typically use cognitive behavioral therapy. I like using Dr. David Burns' book, Feeling Good.
Yeah.
Helping people look at the 10 cognitive distortions that are common to, creating our emotions, whether it be, anger, anxiety, depression, guilt, those kinds of things. So those are two of the big tools. But what brings people into therapy? Oftentimes it's a transition in life. I see a lot of college age people. And, that I think that's a byproduct of just being conveniently located here at the university. My office is about 2 miles from the university. But I think about Erik Erikson's 8 Stages of Man, and people are in that kind of, they're young adults who are a little bit confused about their identity. They're still in the process of individuating from the family.
Sure.
And so they're kind of, examining for the first time. They're on their own for the first time, and they're examining for the first time, what I taught growing up, does that really fit for me? Does that work for me?
Yeah. Who am I?
Who am I? Yes. And so there's some role confusion going on. And, a lot of people, they go into a particular field of study at the university because that's what mom or dad did.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like wearing a straitjacket. It doesn't fit with their personality or who they are. And maybe there's some family expectations there about this is what they're supposed to be. But I help people work through that, and sometimes they end up changing their major, or they go in a different direction because they decide to pursue what's going to make them happy, and not necessarily what they think they should do.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of things that you mentioned there that I guess that the way that people think about things, you had, I think, used the phrase cognitive distortions. And by the way, that Feeling Good book by David Burns, we'll put that in the show notes. So if people want to find that and read it, and I've had a lot of clients over the years who have read that, and it's an excellent book. But it sounds like you're thinking that, the way that people think about things and they distort things, that kind of creates problems for them. And another thing that really can cause problems for people is not only those developmental transitions, but in a lot of the cases of people that you work with, trying to figure out who am I, what do I want to be, does it correspond to what my parents want me to be, and how do I deal with that conflict and develop into the person that I eventually want to be. And so there's a lot of inner conflict that people experience, isn't there?
Yes, there is, absolutely. And just having a safe place to talk about that without being judged is immensely helpful. So that's where the Rogerian, just creating a safe atmosphere and helping them explore those thoughts and feelings, because most people haven't had that before when they come to counseling. So, yeah, and that was my own personal experience. Yeah, I'd never felt safe, talking about those kinds of things in my family of origin.
Yeah. And so I think that for many people, this may be the first time that they've ever had that kind of an experience. And it's really weird, I think, for some clients that they have a person who's listening to them non-judgmentally, and for the therapist not placing any expectations on them that parents may have placed on them, and it's a real different sort of experience for a lot of clients.
It's a liberating experience, I think, and of course, we would talk in the profession call it a corrective emotional experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
It helps to fix some of that baggage they bring from childhood.
Right.
So, but one of the things I didn't mention this earlier, but one of the things I like to do early on with clients is a family genogram.
Uh-huh.
And to me, that's just like a gold mine. Because many people are stuck with maladaptive ways of behaving.
Uh-huh.
Stuck in a pattern of behavior that's no longer getting them results. And I don't do Freudian psychoanalysis, but I think there's a lot of certain credence to looking at the not just early childhood, but the whole growing up process, and what was your family like, and what were the interactions like, and usually we can do a family genogram and go back 2-3 generations in just one session.
Right.
And I usually like to do that pretty early on in the therapy. The first, the intake sessions just kind of get acquainted and talk about the presenting problem. Mm-hmm. But if the person is open to it in the second or third session, we'll do a genogram, and we can identify all kinds of things that are areas you were talking about, inner conflict, where it's helpful for people to understand where does this inner conflict come from, so that they can rise above it.
And so it sounds like when you do the genogram, which sort of looks at family relationships and all that kind of stuff, you kind of look at how a client may have developed some of these inner conflicts, or like you were talking earlier, maybe these cognitive distortions, maybe some of those kind of date back to some of these earlier relationships that people, because it's been so many years, they might not even remember. But, once you start talking about these things in therapy, like, with a genogram or whatnot, people start to remember things. And it's like, oh, yeah, that's right. And, they start to have an aha moment or whatnot. So, and I wonder if for you, talking about the therapy that you do, what is it that a person needs to do to, from the time that you do that intake, you do the genogram, from that initial session to the point where they're done with you, what is it that kind of goes on in between that a person needs to do to improve, or to get to the point where they don't need to come in to see you anymore?
Right. Typically, people need to be open-minded. And part of that's my job, to create a safe place, make sure that they're in a non-judgmental atmosphere.
Yeah.
But just create that safe atmosphere where they feel like they can talk about anything. And of course, we talk about confidentiality at the outset of therapy, and honoring that confidentiality so that they can talk about anything.
Yeah.
And asking them to keep an open mind. I do suggest reading. I do suggest that they try new behaviors at times. I like for people to read the Feeling Good book, because it gives us a common lingo, if you will.
Sure.
I can say, hey, it sounds like you're shoulding on yourself, or, because should statements are one of the 10 cognitive distortions. Had a recent intervention I did with someone recently, where one statement, I identified 3 cognitive distortions in there. There was labeling, there was should statements, and there was a double standard.
Wow.
And with just this one, and really got to the core of some of the issues about this person's belief about themselves, about the world, and about the future. Which, as you and I know, as professionals, that's one definition of depression.
Yeah.
A person who has a negative view of themselves,
right,
the world, and the future.
That's right.
But yeah, I got this person to see that, hey, you're labeling yourself a loser, a failure. You're making should statements. You're saying, I should be able to do better, regardless of the situation, regardless of the circumstances. And also there was there was a double standard. Would you treat someone else that way? and help this person to realize that he's holding himself to a standard that's, he would not hold anyone else to, even his own worst enemy.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Right,
So
right.
really, so part of your recipe for success in helping people is really just setting the stage from the get-go to make sure that they know that whatever you talk about with them, it's just between you and the client. But really, you're looking for a client who's open to
Yes.
listening to suggestions or to having a conversation with you. And as you're having those conversations, I guess that what you're sort of looking for is the way that they think about things and some of those cognitive distortions that we've been talking about, and maybe even having them do a little bit of reading outside of the session too. So not everything occurs in just those therapy sessions. There's some stuff that occurs outside too as well, doesn't it?
Right, right. We, or I personally like to recommend reading that helps a person to think about their thinking, and one of the things that benefits people immensely is when they become aware of how distorted their thinking is, and how those distortions affect their moods, and depending on your mood, how that's going to affect your behavior. And your behavior actually will determine what set of circumstances you find yourself in. So, so it's like a ripple effect in a pond.
Yeah.
I guess just raising awareness has a lot of benefits, and that's where we keep going back to the genogram, because there's usually some connection to childhood where this person developed this assumption. About how they have to be, or how the world is, or how other people are.
Yeah, so really, going back to the genogram and having those conversations with a client, I guess helps put things into context for them.
Absolutely.
And, all these cognitive distortions or these inner conflicts, that if you can look back to, how some of these things may have developed, it places things in context, and it helps with that awareness that you were just talking about a second ago. And I wonder if I know some counselors do this. You were talking about having them read things. I know that some counselors too have clients do like little homework assignments or things of that nature outside of the therapy. Is that something that you do as well?
Absolutely. One of the easiest assignments, well, I say easy, maybe difficult for the clients because the clients are experiencing anxiety. But when you have someone who has panic disorder, they often get to the point where they're bordering on agoraphobia. They're getting that fear of, I'm afraid to go into the store because I'll have a panic attack. And I don't want to feel out of control, because a panic attack, of course, is a very out of control feeling.
Right.
I don't want to panic in public. I may be embarrassed. I may be unable to escape. I may become incapacitated. And it's interesting because I actually learned this technique from one of my patients in the mental health center long, long ago. So I think our patients are often our best teachers.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And this gentleman, he very much wanted to learn a foreign language. And one of the things that he taught me was he had a severe case of panic disorder, and there was a reason for that. It all tied back into his childhood and some trauma and things. So I've used this with a lot of people, and it's often very successful. Even if you are feeling anxious, go ahead and drive your car to that place. Get there early, and just sit there and have a little time to relax, a little time to slow your breathing, and you always have the option of you can leave if you want to.
Okay.
But that was basically what he would do. He really had a strong desire to learn this foreign language, and this was before the internet, so you couldn't do it online.
Right.
And of course he needed the social interaction anyway, because this is a gentleman that was pretty isolated. But so I'll have clients go, leave early, drive to wherever it is that you have to go, and get there and slow your breathing, do some meditation, and you always have the option of you can leave if you just feel like you can't do it. But most folks, by the they get there, and by the time they go through the calming exercises, and that's something that we do in therapy. We can do deep breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation. Those are some basic cognitive behavioral techniques to use. Most folks will say, once I got there and went through the breathing exercises and the calming exercises, I was able to go into the grocery store, get my groceries, and walk out without any incident. So
really learning those skills is an important part of what you do with clients as well, to kind of help them have that success experience, and having them use those skills in a real life situation. I guess in a situation that they might want to avoid, because of fear. But once they have those skills, I guess that they can be successful.
Yes, and I do ask people. I know my training's in clinical psychology, and your background, I think, maybe is counseling psychology. But clinical psychologists tend to look for problems. And so one of the things I like to tell my counseling patients is, not only come in and tell me about the problem areas, but tell me your success stories too. And I think that teaches me a lot about what works for that individual person.
Yes.
And also it's just a confidence builder for them to come in and tell some of their success stories, that they're doing something differently. Before counseling, I wasn't doing this, and now, I'm able to do this, and it's a real gratifying for me to hear the stories, because it's an honor just to be part of the process in that person's walk with whatever trouble they're experiencing. But for them to see that this is working. I'm getting better. I'm not as restricted. I'm not as limited as I used to be. I'm able to do more than I used to be able to do, because I was so limited by the fears that I had.
Yeah, and how liberating that must be, a feeling for clients when they get to that point, and to obviously see the benefits of having participated in therapy. So I really like that that's part of what you do for that recipe for success. But, I also know that, having done this myself for a long time, and I know you've done this for a long time, you've had some challenges. You've had clients who are challenging in some form or fashion, and how do you help those people? I mean, maybe you have someone that comes to mind, a client that you've worked with that has been challenging, and it's not always easy to get a client from point A to point B. So maybe you could talk a little bit about maybe a client that you've worked with who's challenging, and how did you help them?
Okay. I am not a substance abuse counselor. That's not my expertise or forte. I did counsel one lady with alcohol dependence years ago, and pretty much the same approach. I know that type of therapy is often confrontive, done in a group format, but she called me. And I think she picked me out of the phone book. It's been so long ago. I can't. People don't use the phone book anymore. The yellow pages, it's internet and so forth.
Yeah.
But she found me. So this has been years ago. Found me in the yellow pages, called me, and she said, "I want help with my alcohol addiction." And so I thought, okay, this person at least has enough insight to know that their drinking is a problem. So same approach, keep create a safe place for her to talk about anything. And of course, when we meet, there's a lot more going on than just the drinking. And there's a lot of history, a lot of trauma in her background. I did at one point have to get her spouse involved in the therapy.
All right.
So at that point, it became a little bit of family therapy. He was very concerned about her drinking. At another point, I had to actually get her into a 28-day rehab. But again, she was open to that.
Okay.
She was getting some pressure from her husband, and I won't say pressure from me, but she was getting support from me. Some education around that about how this can help you to put the drinking to rest. And at one point, after her a period of sobriety, I went to an AA meeting with her. She got her 1 year chip that she had sober for a year, and I went, pro bono, just no fee, just to be a support. And that was interesting because I was. The family wasn't really supportive of her at that point, but I was there for her.
Yeah,
and I think she was someone that I saw on a regular basis, weekly basis, which to me is a pretty high frequency. Some of my patients see much less frequently. We'll often start out once a week and go to every other week, and then once a month as they progress. But ended up seeing this lady for a couple of years, and took her as far as I thought I could get her, and had to refer her on to someone who was a trauma specialist, because I felt like she needed, she had reached a point of diminishing returns with me and my skill set. And I think that's one thing that counselors need to be humble about, is that, there's only so far I can go with this person.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
In their walk. And, I was honest with her. I said, I don't want to just take your money and you come in here and complain about the same things every week. I think I've taken you as far as I can get you, but I have someone else in mind, and I'll be there for you during this transition. And she was receptive to that, and I was able to successfully transition her to a therapist with some different, different skill set.
Yeah. And
continue her therapy there.
Well, I think that the issue, I think, for the challenges, you brought up this lady who had alcohol dependence. And I think that just to kind of add on to that oftentimes, for me at least, some of the challenging clients are the ones who have a dual diagnosis.
Yes.
And, substance abuse perhaps being one of those, in addition to something else. But I think that those are the challenging clients for me personally. And I like what you just said at the end there, because I share that philosophy too, that I don't know everything. That, if I have a client that I feel like could benefit from seeing somebody else, I'm going to be right there and make that referral. And I think it's very dangerous for a therapist to think that they can basically be the answer to everybody's problems. And that's the therapist I think that I'd want to stay away from personally if I were in need of counseling. But just to kind of bring this to an end here, our interview, Jeff, what are some things that about you or the way that you do therapy that would draw a person to you or make them want to come and see you to do counseling?
I guess just I do have a lot of empathy for people, and you touched on it earlier in the interview because of my own personal experience. There was a long time that I suffered in silence.
Yeah.
And, after the loss of my father and my brother, and I didn't know what to do with that grief. And, of course, I was young when it happened, and resources weren't made available to me until I became an adult and had some, the power myself to make those decisions. And so I work real well with people who have suffered a loss or who are, discouraged, fearful, because I've been down that path myself. Not that my path would be identical or their problems would be identical to mine, but I can have a lot of empathy for those people. And I do understand how frightening it can be to pick up that phone the first time.
Oh, yeah.
Or now it's by email, internet, whatever, but to reach out and say, I need help with this problem. This has gotten, it's beyond my coping resources. I can't handle this on my own anymore. I need someone's help with this. Yeah. So, I don't care if folks come to see me or another counselor. There's plenty of well-trained, compassionate people out there. People don't need to suffer in silence in this day and age. If they have a problem that they continue to struggle with, and it seems bigger than they are, it's beyond their ability to cope, pick up the phone, call someone, talk to a trained professional.
Yeah, that's really good advice there. And speaking of that, if a person wants to contact you for counseling, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, I'm located in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Physical address is 1138 Dow Street. The phone for my practice is 615-631-2866. And also, I have a small, I guess you'd call it biography on Psychology Today. They have a tool called Find a Therapist, and it talks about my training experience, type of practice that I have. And we really didn't touch upon that today, but I'd also do a lot of psychological assessment, and the Psychology Today biography goes into more detail with that. In addition to counseling patients with anxiety, depression, and grief, I do a lot of psychological assessment of ADHD, learning disabilities. I also do a lot of vocational assessments for the state of Tennessee, and I do disability assessments for the state of Tennessee.
Well, okay. If I really appreciate you coming on the podcast here today, Jeff. You've given us a lot of good information, a lot of good food for thought for the mental note takers, and have a great rest of the day.
You too, Chris.
Okay.
Thank you for doing this, and thank you for all your support when I began my practice many years ago.
Not a problem at all.
It's been a real blessing.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay. Have a good day.
Okay, I'd like to thank Jeff for coming on today's podcast interview to share his perspectives on the counseling process and why people have the problems that they do. He had talked about this term cognitive distortions, and that's actually my question for you for today. Do you remember what he meant by this? What are cognitive distortions? Well, these are inaccurate thoughts or ways of thinking about things, and they play an important role in mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. And so what Jeff tries to do is to help people become aware of these inaccuracies in how they view the world or themselves or others. And if they can change those thinking patterns, then they'll change the way that they feel and the way that they behave, usually in more positive ways. So that's the goal of counseling. I think one of the takeaway from today's podcast interview not only has to do with cognitive distortions, but also family of origin. Remember, Jeff has noted that he talks about clients' families of origin in counseling sessions because they play a very important role in shaping clients' belief systems. In other words, what they believe to be true about themselves, what they believe to be true about others, what they believe to be true about the world. And in some cases, these beliefs are inaccurate. And so the idea is, once again, for them to become aware not only of how they develop these beliefs, but perhaps looking at whether they want to continue believing that way, how it's impacting them, and if they did change their beliefs, how they would want to change them. Okay, if you would like the show notes of today's podcast interview, please visit my website, chrisquarto.com. And as always, please spread the word on Facebook and Twitter about the Make a Mental Note podcast series. People can get this through iTunes, through Stitcher Radio, and of course on my website. Thanks a lot and have a great rest of the week.